The old black-and-white photograph lay nestled within its brittle, acid-free sleeve, a seemingly innocuous window into a bygone era. It captured a moment in time, specifically 1908, portraying a class of school children gathered proudly in front of their modest, single-room schoolhouse. Their faces, though rendered in shades of gray, radiated a palpable cheerfulness, a collective innocence that seemed to defy the sepia tones of history. Boys in knickerbockers and girls in long dresses, their hair meticulously braided or smartly parted, stood shoulder to shoulder, a tableau of youthful optimism. The sun, high and bright, cast long, distinct shadows behind each child, stretching across the dusty ground like silent companions. Every figure, every tree, even the picket fence framing the school, boasted its own dark twin, a testament to the vivid midday light. It was a picture that evoked a nostalgic sigh, a tender reminiscence of simpler times, until your gaze, like an insistent whisper, was drawn to one particular child. Her name, as history would later reveal, was Mary. Mary stood near the center left, a small, unassuming girl with wide, earnest eyes and a faint, almost imperceptible smile. She was dressed like the others, her hands clasped demurely in front of her, yet something about her was profoundly, chillingly different. While every other child's shadow elongated behind them, a dark, faithful echo of their form, Mary had none. The sunlight, so crisp and precise in delineating the world around her, seemed to simply pass through the space where her shadow should have been. It was an absence, stark and impossible, amidst a sea of presences. The ground directly behind her was just ground, illuminated as if no one stood there at all, a void where darkness ought to have been. This singular, unsettling detail transformed the portrait from a charming historical artifact into a haunting enigma, daring anyone who looked closely enough to question the very fabric of reality. Before we delve deeper into this truly unsettling mystery and many others like it that defy easy explanation, I urge you to take a moment. If you're captivated by stories that peel back the layers of history to reveal the bizarre and the inexplicable, then consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you won't miss a single dive into the past's most perplexing puzzles. Your support helps us uncover these forgotten tales. The setting itself, a rural American schoolhouse, was typical for the turn of the 20th century. Constructed of rough-hewn timber, its windows gleamed faintly, reflecting a sky that must have been a brilliant blue that day. A small bell tower crowned its peak, hinting at the daily rhythms of lessons and play. The landscape around it was sparse but green, suggesting a quiet, agricultural community, far removed from the bustling cities. Life here was ordered, predictable, governed by seasons and sun. It was precisely this mundane, almost pastoral backdrop that made the anomaly of Mary's missing shadow so jarring, so utterly out of place. It was a glitch in a perfectly painted canvas, a silent scream amidst a chorus of laughter. The person who first truly grappled with this profound optical impossibility was Professor Alistair Finch, a man whose life revolved around the tactile truth of historical documents and the chemical intricacies of early photography. A renowned historian and photographic archivist, Finch possessed a meticulous eye, honed by decades of sifting through faded daguerreotypes and fragile glass plates. He stumbled upon the image during a routine digitization project at the Regional Historical Society. His initial reaction, as he later recounted, was not one of mystical awe, but of professional disbelief. "Preposterous," he'd muttered, his brow furrowed, leaning closer to his high-resolution monitor. A trick of the light, an underdeveloped plate, perhaps a crude alteration. But the more he looked, the more his initial skepticism gave way to a gnawing intellectual curiosity. Professor Finch, a man grounded firmly in logic and empirical evidence, immediately set about attempting to debunk his own observation. He meticulously examined the photograph under various magnifications, searching for any telltale signs of damage to the emulsion, scratches on the negative, or inconsistencies in the photographic process. He cross-referenced the image with other photographs taken by the same photographer during that period, scrutinizing their lighting and shadow definitions. He even considered the possibility of a cleverly executed prank, though the quality and age of the print made that seem increasingly improbable. He analyzed the direction and intensity of the light, noting how perfectly it illuminated every other subject. The harshness of the sun meant that shadows should have been at their most pronounced. He even consulted with photochemical experts discussing theoretical scenarios of localized emulsion defects or atmospheric phenomena that might selectively obscure a single shadow while leaving all others intact. Each avenue he explored, however, led to a dead end. Each expert he consulted, after careful consideration, could offer no conventional explanation. The more he tried to rationalize it, the more stubbornly illogical the image became. The unsettling truth, as it slowly dawned upon Professor Finch, was that the shadowless child was undeniably real. The absence was not an artifact of the medium, nor a trick of perception. It was a genuine, inexplicable void. Every conventional explanation had been exhausted, every scientific and photographic principle tested and found wanting. Mary, the little girl in the 1908 school portrait, simply had no shadow. And this fundamental, impossible fact, laid bare in the stark black and white of an old photograph, established not just a mystery, but a profound, almost terrifying challenge to the known world. It was a silent question echoing across more than a century, demanding an answer that seemed to exist beyond the realm of human understanding. Professor Finch knew with a chilling certainty that his life was about to take an unexpected turn, drawn irrevocably into the silent orbit of a girl who, quite simply, was not entirely there. Professor Finch, fueled by an almost desperate academic curiosity, now plunged headfirst into the daunting archives, determined to peel back the layers of time surrounding the enigmatic photograph. His initial checks had confirmed the impossible. Mary's shadow was simply not there. With renewed vigor, he meticulously cross-referenced every name on the school's 1908 enrollment ledger against the faces captured on the photographic plate. Each child, including Mary, was accounted for, their identities confirmed by faded ink and school records. Mary's entry was sparse, typical for a child of that era from a modest family. Full name, birth date, and parents' names. Nothing more. No detailed attendance records, no notes about her personality, just the bare minimum data. This lack of personal information, rather than satisfying his inquiry, only deepened the mystery, casting Mary's already unusual presence in the photograph into an even more unsettling light. The more he delved, the more Finch realized he needed to understand the broader cultural landscape of 1908. Superstition, he knew, ran far deeper then, especially in rural communities. He spent weeks immersed in turn-of-the-century folklore, devouring texts on local legends, spiritualism, and societal fears. He discovered that shadows held a profound significance in various cultural beliefs. Many cultures, even in the supposedly enlightened West, still harbored deep-seated anxieties about shadows being intrinsically linked to the soul or life force. A person without a shadow in many superstitions was considered an omen of ill fortune, a harbinger of death, or even something less than human. Some tales spoke of individuals who had lost their shadows as having lost a piece of their very essence, vulnerable to malevolent forces or already claimed by them. It wasn't just a quirk of light, it was, to the minds of the past, a spiritual cataclysm. This historical context added a chilling, almost palpable dread to the photograph, transforming it from a bizarre anomaly into a potential testament of a long-forgotten terror. Initially, Professor Finch had tried to rationalize the missing shadow. He toyed with scientific explanations, however far-fetched. Could it have been an unusual atmospheric phenomenon? A bizarre refraction of light that flawlessly obscured just one child's shadow, while leaving all others intact? He dismissed this quickly. The physics simply didn't align. Perhaps a trick of the eye or a deliberate manipulation by the photographer? He scrutinized the plate under powerful microscopes, looking for any evidence of tampering, retouching, or a staged optical illusion. The photographic emulsion was pristine, the image unaltered. The photographer, whoever they were, had captured exactly what was there, or rather, what was not there. He even considered the most outlandish possibility, a collective hallucination, somehow captured on film. But that idea was swiftly relegated to the realm of fantasy. Every logical explanation he pursued simply dead-ended, leaving him staring back at the impossible truth of the shadowless child. The pursuit of this anomaly began to consume Professor Finch. The neat lines of his academic life blurred, replaced by the chaotic dedication of an obsessive. His office, usually a bastion of order, became a warren of stacked books, scattered microfilm reels, and enlarged prints of the photograph. Sleepless nights were spent hunched over his desk, the photograph glowing eerily under the lamp, Mary's vacant space where a shadow should be staring back at him. He felt an intense, almost personal responsibility to her, to understand why her image defied explanation. His colleagues noticed his withdrawal, his gaunt appearance, his singular focus on what they considered a mere photographic curiosity. His reputation, built on diligent, verifiable history, now felt precariously balanced on the edge of an inexplicable void. Yet he could not stop. The mystery had burrowed deep into his professional core, challenging everything he thought he knew about documentation and reality. Then a faint glimmer of something, a whisper from the past, finally broke through the static. Tucked away in a dusty box of miscellaneous local newspapers from roughly the same period, in the archives of the Historical Society, Finch uncovered a small, almost inconsequential article. It was from a local weekly, poorly printed and easily overlooked. The headline spoke of peculiar happenings in the school district, detailing minor unsettling events. Livestock behaving strangely in fields bordering the school, small objects inexplicably moving or disappearing from local homes, and a pervasive, lingering sense of unease reported by a few villagers. The article itself offered no definitive explanations, quickly dismissing the occurrences as mere coincidence or the product of overactive imaginations in a quiet, isolated community. Crucially, it made no direct mention of Mary, nor did it speak of shadows. Yet the timing, the location, and the unsettling tone resonated deeply with Finch. It wasn't a direct link, but it was the first tangible clue that something out of the ordinary might have been stirring in that seemingly idyllic rural setting, a subtle ripple in the fabric of everyday life. Precisely when Mary's shadow had vanished into thin air, he felt a shiver, not of cold, but recognition. He was on the right path. Professor Finch, a man whose life revolved around the precise geometry of historical fact, now found himself pursuing a trail of clues that felt more akin to phantom whispers than solid evidence. His initial investigation into the baffling photograph had yielded little beyond confirming Mary's unsettling lack of a shadow. Yet the obsessive energy that now consumed him drove him deeper into the remote corners of the archive, a place where forgotten narratives often lay dormant, waiting for a curious eye to awaken them. It was during one such late-night foray, surrounded by the musty scent of aging paper and the hushed reverence of untold stories, that his fingers brushed against a small, leather-bound volume tucked away behind a row of oversized ledgers. This was no ordinary school record, it was a diary, and the inscription on its faded cover identified its owner as Eleanor Vance, the very schoolmistress captured in the perplexing photograph, standing stoically beside the shadowless child. The initial entries were mundane, detailing lessons, discipline, and the quotidian struggles of managing a rural classroom in 1908. But as Finch delved deeper, turning brittle pages with painstaking care, A subtle shift in tone began to emerge. Eleanor's elegant cursive script, initially so confident and clear, started to betray a growing unease. She wrote of Mary not with the usual affection reserved for her young charges, but with a detached observation, describing her as unusually quiet and oddly observant. There was a recurring phrase, "Mary sees things others do not," which Eleanor often followed with a dismissive comment about a child's vivid imagination, yet the frequency of these observations spoke volumes. Finch felt a prickle of anticipation, a historian's intuition screaming that he was finally on the precipice of something significant. The diary entries revealed Eleanor's subtle but growing discomfort with the child, an unspoken apprehension that permeated the otherwise cheerful descriptions of school life. She meticulously documented strange occurrences, small disturbances that seemed to defy logical explanation, yet always seemed to vanish when Eleanor herself tried to investigate, only to be reportedly witnessed again by Mary. These were fleeting glimpses, a misplaced teaching aid appearing in an impossible location, a whisper heard when no one was near, a chill in the warmest corner of the classroom. Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, tried to rationalize them away, attributing them to fatigue or overactive nerves, but her increasingly anxious prose told a different story. Driven by these cryptic hints, Finch broadened his research to encompass the local community's folklore and oral histories. He spent days poring over dusty regional histories, old newspaper archives, and even obscure ethnographical studies of the area. He discovered that the region was steeped in ancient myths, tales passed down through generations around crackling firesides. Local legends spoke of a shadow eater, a spectral entity said to inhabit the ancient woods bordering the school grounds, a creature that could steal reflections and souls. There were also hushed mentions of a silent watcher, a presence that shadowed the unwary, waiting for an opportune moment to claim its due. These stories, often dismissed as mere children's tales or the imaginative constructs of isolated rural communities, now took on a chilling new significance. They were the very superstitions Eleanor Vance, a woman of education and reason, would have undoubtedly scoffed at. Yet their recurrence in the local narrative resonated deeply with the unsettling implications of Mary's missing shadow. Just as Finch felt he was on the verge of a breakthrough, correlating the diary entries with the local lore, he encountered a devastating roadblock. A significant section of Eleanor's diary was missing. Pages, perhaps a dozen or more, had been meticulously, almost surgically torn from the volume, leaving only jagged remnants along the spine. The missing period precisely coincided with the weeks leading up to the school photograph. The neat, deliberate act of removal spoke volumes. This was no accidental tear or natural decay. This was an intentional concealment, a desperate effort to erase information, to bury a truth that Eleanor Vance, for reasons yet unknown, deemed too dangerous or too horrifying to commit to posterity. The missing pages felt like a physical wound in the narrative, a gaping hole where the crucial pieces of the puzzle should have been. Frustration warred with a renewed sense of urgency. Why would Eleanor Vance, a woman who seemed so dedicated to her role, meticulously redact her own personal record? What had transpired during those critical weeks that necessitated such an act of suppression? Returning to the photograph with fresh eyes, armed with the unsettling implications of Eleanor's diary and the local legends, Professor Finch began to notice other, more subtle anomalies that had escaped his initial, purely technical scrutiny. Beyond Mary's lack of a shadow, he now perceived a faint, almost imperceptible blur around her feet, as if the ground beneath her hadn't quite registered her presence with the same solidity as the other children. More chillingly, studying the faces of the children immediately adjacent to Mary, he saw not the uniformly cheerful expressions he had first noted, but a fleeting flicker in their eyes, a subtle tension around their mouths. It was as if, for a fraction of a second, just before the camera's shutter clicked, they had sensed something amiss, an unnameable disturbance radiating from the shadowless girl at their side. Their smiles seemed just a touch too wide, their gazes a fraction too fixed, betraying a nascent fear, a childish instinct warning them of something profoundly unnatural in their midst. The photograph was not merely a portrait of innocence. It was a snapshot of a moment poised on the edge of a forgotten terror. The weight of his discoveries pressed heavily upon Professor Finch. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he had stumbled upon something far more profound than a mere photographic anomaly. This was not a trick of light or a printing error. It was a ghost story, not of specters in white sheets, but of a forgotten tragedy woven into the fabric of time itself. Driven by an academic integrity that bordered on obsession, he attempted to share his burgeoning theories with a few trusted colleagues, seasoned historians known for their open-mindedness, yet even they, with all their intellectual curiosity, recoiled. Dr. Eleanor Harding, a specialist in early 20th century social history, chuckled politely, suggesting Finch was allowing his imagination to run wild, attributing human qualities to an old plate's imperfections. "Alistair, darling," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension, "it's merely an overexposed negative, or perhaps a clumsy attempt at retouching. Shadows can be very deceptive." Another, Professor David Shaw, a renowned expert in photography's early days, posited a complex interplay of light refraction, lens aberration, and the rudimentary processing techniques of the era, all aligning to create a convincing, albeit purely optical, illusion. Their dismissal, though gentle, was absolute, reinforcing Finch's isolation. He was alone in his conviction, a lone voice whispering of shadows where others saw only light. This widespread skepticism, even among those he respected, paradoxically solidified his resolve. He wasn't chasing phantoms, he was simply seeing what others refused to acknowledge. Undeterred by academic scorn, Finch pivoted his research, delving deeper into Mary's genealogical records. It was a tedious, painstaking process, cross-referencing census data, birth and death certificates, and local church registries. He expected to find a typical rural lineage, perhaps unremarkable, but what he uncovered sent a fresh wave of unease through him. Mary's family, the Blackwoods, as they were known, had a perplexing history within the region. Records stretching back several generations hinted at an unsettling pattern. Unexplained disappearances, particularly among younger female children, often attributed to sudden illnesses or simply lost to the woods. There was a recurring entry in census records where a child would appear in one decade, then vanish in the next with no corresponding death certificate or relocation record. Local folklore, subtly woven into archived community histories, spoke of the Blackwoods being touched by the forest or having a kinship with the unseen. These were not direct accusations of witchcraft or dark practices, but rather a pervasive understanding of a familial proximity to something ancient and inexplicable, a generational tie to the phenomenon that now manifested itself so chillingly in Mary. It suggested that Mary's unique condition was not an isolated incident, but potentially an echo of an older, deeper pact or curse. Determined to gain a more personal perspective, Finch embarked on interviews with the town's oldest residents, those who might have lived through or remembered the period. He visited nursing homes and community centers, armed with a carefully preserved reprint of the school photograph. He showed it to frail, spectacled eyes, hoping for a spark of recognition. Yet the responses were maddeningly vague, unsettlingly inconsistent. Many residents, their memories clouded by time's relentless march, couldn't recall Mary specifically. Those who did, however, offered descriptions that were less than concrete. "Oh, the quiet one elderly woman murmured, her gaze distant. "Always by herself, even in a crowd." Another, a man whose hands trembled with age, squinted at the image. "She was different. Didn't make much noise. Always watching, I remember that. Always watching." The most chilling response came from a former classmate now in her late 90s, who stared intently at Mary's image for a long moment before whispering, She wasn't really there, was she? Not like the rest of us. It was as if Mary's presence, even in their faded memories, was transient, an indistinct figure on the periphery just beyond the grasp of clear recall. Her shadowless existence seemed to extend beyond the photograph, subtly influencing the very fabric of personal history, blurring her own memory in the minds of those who had known her. Finch then shifted his focus to the elusive photographer, the chronicler of this unsettling moment. Researching local business directories and newspaper archives from the early 1900s, he identified a man named Arthur Sterling, an itinerant photographer who had briefly set up shop in the town. Sterling's tenure was surprisingly short-lived. Just months after the school photograph was taken, Arthur Sterling vanished. His studio and all its equipment was abandoned, left to gather dust. There were no records of him selling his business, or even packing up. He simply left, abruptly and without explanation, leaving behind his entire livelihood, a move utterly uncharacteristic for a tradesman in that era. The local paper, usually keen to report on every coming and going, had only a terse single-line announcement: photographer Arthur Sterling has departed town. No forwarding address, no farewell notice, nothing. It was as if he too had been absorbed by the same inexplicable force that had touched Mary. His sudden flight, leaving his entire life behind, spoke volumes of a profound fear, a terror so potent it drove him to abandon everything. A profound, haunting realization began to coalesce in Finch's mind, connecting these disparate threads. Mary wasn't merely a child lacking a shadow in a single photograph. Her shadowlessness was merely the most overt symptom of a larger, more insidious anomaly. Her presence, or perhaps the entity connected to her, seemed to subtly alter her surroundings, not just physically but metaphysically. It affected memory, blurring recollections, making her almost imperceptible in the minds of others. It caused unexplained disappearances in her family line, historical echoes of a larger phenomenon. It drove a man, the photographer, to abandon his life in a panicked flight. The faint blur around her feet in the photograph, the flicker of nascent fear in the eyes of the children near her. These were not isolated details. They were manifestations of a pervasive influence, a subtle yet powerful distortion of reality that radiated from Mary. She was not just shadowless. Her very essence seemed to unravel the established order, affecting memory, perception, and even the physical presence of those around her. The photograph was a chillingly passive-aggressive warning, a frozen moment capturing the precise point where the mundane intersected with the terrifyingly inexplicable. The lingering image of the children's subtly disturbed expressions in the photograph gnawed at Professor Finch, cementing his conviction that something profoundly unnatural had transpired. The missing diary pages were a deliberate act of obfuscation, a desperate attempt to bury a truth too terrible to name. He knew the key lay not just in Eleanor Vance's hidden fears, but in the experiences of others who had been present, particularly the man whose lens had captured the anomaly, the photographer. Finch had already noted the man's abrupt departure from town, a detail that now screamed of more than just a career change. It suggested flight. His investigation led him to the remnants of the old photography studio, now a dilapidated shed on the outskirts of town, long abandoned and reclaimed by nature. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the decaying roof, illuminating forgotten negatives and rusted equipment. It was here, amidst the ghostly archives of past lives and faded smiles, that Finch made his next pivotal discovery. Tucked away in a false bottom of a heavy wooden darkroom chest, concealed beneath a stack of glass plates, he found a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, ink-faded, but their contents would unravel a truth more terrifying than he had dared to imagine. This was the personal journal of the photographer himself, a man named Thomas Abernathy. The early entries were mundane, detailing exposure times, client appointments, and the fickle nature of the local weather. But as Finch delved deeper, The tone shifted, growing increasingly erratic, the handwriting becoming hurried, almost frantic. Abernathy's entries began to detail not just the technical aspects of his craft, but the growing horror that consumed him as he developed the school portrait plate. Abernathy wrote of his initial excitement at capturing such a vibrant scene, a classroom full of bright faces. He meticulously described the development process, the slow emergence of images from the chemical bath. Then, the first tremor of fear, an anomaly he couldn't explain. He described seeing Mary's shadow in an initial test print, faint but undeniably present. He then reran the development, perhaps adjusting chemicals, only to find the shadow diminished, flickering at the edges. He dismissed it as a developing error, a trick of the light in his dark room, attributing it to fatigue or faulty chemicals. But subsequent attempts, carefully documented with precise times and formulas, yielded an increasingly unsettling result. Mary's shadow continued to recede, disappearing and reappearing in successive plates, until it vanished entirely, leaving a stark, impossible void. Abernathy's entries became a descent into terror. He detailed sleepless nights, the photograph lying face up on his bedside table, Mary's shadowless form, a silent accusation. He tried to rationalize it, to find any logical explanation, but none sufficed. He wrote of the distinct, pervasive sense of dread that permeated the studio, a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air. He began to fear the photograph itself, seeing it not as a captured moment, but as a window into something ancient and malevolent. In a desperate, almost pleading entry, Abernathy recounted his attempt to warn the schoolmistress, Eleanor Vance. He had gone to her, the half-dried print clenched in his trembling hand, trying to explain the impossible. He expected shock, perhaps even shared fear. Instead, Eleanor, whom he had always respected, had dismissed his fears. She attributed his distress to stress, to overwork, perhaps even to an ailment of the mind. She had looked at the photograph, her gaze lingering on Mary, but she claimed to see nothing amiss, nothing beyond a slightly underexposed area. Abernathy, however, wrote that her eyes, though denying his words, held a flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher, a desperate fear, perhaps, or a profound, terrible knowing she dared not acknowledge. He felt even then that she was protecting something, or someone. The journal introduced a term that chilled Finch to the bone: shadow stealer. Abernathy, a newcomer to the isolated community, had initially scoffed at the local myth, dismissing it as quaint, rural superstition. But as Mary's shadow continued its impossible disappearance, as the insidious dread tightened its grip, he began to believe. He wrote of hushed conversations he had overheard among the townsfolk, tales of an entity that took not just shadows but pieces of people's souls, leaving them hollow, quiet, and strangely disengaged. He meticulously cross-referenced his observations with the few guarded fragments of local folklore he could gather, realizing with dawning horror that Mary fit the description of a victim, or perhaps even a vessel. The final entries in the journal were a testament to pure, unadulterated terror. Abernathy described the crushing weight of revelation, the horrifying certainty that something truly malevolent walked among them. He detailed his frantic preparations, packing only essentials, burning his other photographic plates almost as if to erase any other traces of the supernatural he might have inadvertently captured. His last entry was scrawled, barely legible, a terrified confession of his flight from the town, from his livelihood, from everything he knew. He was convinced that Mary, the quiet, shadowless girl, was somehow connected to the entity that sought to claim shadows and ultimately souls. He believed his continued presence in the town would only make him the next target, that the shadow stealer would not tolerate an eyewitness. His abrupt departure, previously a puzzling footnote, was now illuminated as an act of desperate self-preservation born of unspeakable fear. The photographer had not merely left, he had fled for his very life. Professor Finch's pursuit of the elusive truth led him down an unexpected path, one that diverged sharply from the neatly cataloged public archives. Driven by the lingering question of Eleanor Vance's motives in excising those crucial pages from her official diary, he began to hypothesize the existence of a more private, more candid record. His meticulous search through the dusty corners of the Historical Society's lesser-known collections among personal effects donated years after Eleanor's passing eventually yielded a small, leather-bound volume, unassuming in its appearance, tucked away among a collection of correspondence and faded photographs. This was it, Eleanor's second diary, a deeply personal journal kept secret from the main archives, hidden not out of neglect, but out of a profound and desperate need for discretion. As Finch carefully turned its brittle pages, a tremor of anticipation ran through him. This was not the measured, reflective voice of the dutiful schoolmistress, but the raw, unvarnished confession of a woman haunted by a terrible choice. The entries, written in a hurried, sometimes almost illegible script, spoke of a growing dread that had nothing to do with lesson plans or community events. They spoke of Mary, yes, but also of another child, a younger boy named Thomas, whose health had mysteriously begun to fail in the weeks leading up to the school portrait. Thomas, Eleanor noted with increasing alarm, had been losing his vibrancy, his energy, and sometimes, she wrote in bewildered terror, his very reflection in puddles and polished surfaces seemed to flicker, as if struggling to hold its form. The local doctor had been baffled, attributing it to a rare, unnamed malady, but Eleanor, a woman who dismissed superstition, found herself grappling with an inexplicable, growing fear that defied all medical explanation. The diary then plunged into a harrowing account, recounting Eleanor's desperation. She had sought wisdom from the oldest woman in the village, a reclusive figure known for her knowledge of old ways and forgotten lore, a woman Eleanor had always dismissed as a harmless eccentric. This woman, with eyes that seemed to see far more than she let on, had spoken in hushed tones of the Shadow Eater, not as a child's fable, but as a hungry presence that occasionally stirred in the ancient woods, drawn to innocence, to vitality. It claimed not lives directly, but the very essence of being, leaving its victims frail, listless, and ultimately fading into oblivion. The only way to appease it, the old woman had whispered, was a sacrifice, an exchange. A shadow for a shadow, a life force for a life force. The horrifying truth then unfolded in Eleanor's trembling hand. The diary entries revealed a tragic, unspeakable pact. To save Thomas, the boy she had grown to love as her own, to draw the malevolent entity away from his rapidly diminishing light, Eleanor had made a desperate bargain. She had, inadvertently or otherwise, offered Mary as a substitute. The details were veiled in Eleanor's anguish, but the implication was stark. Mary, an unusually quiet child, often overlooked, perhaps already possessing a faint vulnerability that drew the entity's attention, became the unwitting recipient of the Shadow Eater's focus. Eleanor's entries chronicled Mary's gradual transformation, her growing detachment, the subtle way her presence seemed to become less substantial, leading tragically to the day of the photograph when her shadow simply ceased to exist. It became clear through Eleanor's tormented confessions that Mary was either an unwitting vessel, a child unknowingly marked by this ancient entity, or perhaps already subtly claimed by it in some deeper spiritual sense, her shadow simply being the final, visible piece of the bargain. Eleanor wrote of the crushing weight of her guilt, the torment of seeing Mary standing there perfectly formed, yet subtly incomplete, a ghost in plain sight. Her conscience, however, was also clouded by a chilling, self-preserving logic. Thomas was recovering, his vitality slowly returning, his reflection once again firm in the daylight. The entity for now seemed appeased. The cost of this concealment was immense, both for Eleanor and for the historical record. Her subsequent efforts to eradicate Mary from the public memory, to tear out those incriminating pages from her official diary, were now fully explained. She wasn't merely hiding a secret. She was trying to protect the town from the truth of her own terrible deed and from the knowledge that such a malevolent force truly existed among them. She believed that by erasing Mary, by making her a forgotten child, she could bury the evidence of her pact and prevent widespread panic, perhaps even prevent the entity from returning. Eleanor lived out her days burdened by a secret that slowly consumed her, a silent witness to a sacrifice she had orchestrated. Professor Finch closed the private journal, his hands trembling slightly. The shadowless child in the photograph wasn't a random, inexplicable anomaly. She was the tangible, frozen-in-time result of a desperate, terrible choice, a profound act of despair and sacrifice made by a woman pushed to the brink. The consequences of that choice had not only rippled through Mary's brief life, but had also cast a long, unseen pall over the entire community, echoing through the generations, culminating in the chilling image that had first captured Finch's attention. The cheerful facade of the 1908 school portrait now seemed like the cruelest deception, a testament to a hidden tragedy, a silent scream frozen in time. The mystery had finally yielded its devastating truth. The climax of discovery hit Professor Finch with the force of a physical blow. He now understood the photograph not as a mere historical artifact, a fascinating curiosity from a bygone era, but as a silent scream frozen in time. The cheerful facade, once so disarming, was now revealed as nothing more than a shroud, a thin veil attempting to conceal a profound and devastating tragedy. Every smiling face, every bright-eyed child became a silent accomplice in the perpetuation of a lie, a collective effort, perhaps unwitting, to forget the terrible price paid for their momentary peace. The sunlight streaming through the schoolhouse window, once appearing so innocent and idyllic, now seemed to mock him, illuminating the absence that spoke volumes, the shadow that was not there. The weight of this knowledge, gained through relentless research and the deciphering of tormented confessions, settled heavily upon Professor Finch. The shadowless child, Mary, was no longer just an anomaly to be catalogued and explained away. She was a symbol, a stark and haunting representation of a forgotten sacrifice, a hidden terror woven into the very fabric of that small, unsuspecting community. Finch felt a deep, almost personal anguish for the child, for Eleanor, and for the silent suffering endured by all involved. The academic pursuit had transcended into something far more visceral, far more human. He had unearthed not just a historical secret, but a wound that had never truly healed. The initial intellectual curiosity had transformed into a profound sense of sorrow and a chilling understanding of the darkness that can lurk beneath the most mundane surfaces. While the why was shockingly clear, the desperation of Eleanor Vance, the pact, the substitution, the what remained largely shrouded in an unsettling mystique. The entity itself, the Shadow Eater, the malevolent force that demanded such a terrible toll, remained largely undefined. Its true nature was hinted at through Eleanor's terrified entries and the photographer's frantic journal, spoken of in hushed tones as an ancient local myth, a presence without form that consumed shadows and, by implication, souls. This preservation of an unknown, an element of cosmic horror, was deliberate on the part of the historical accounts he uncovered. No one dared to fully describe it, to give it form or name, as if doing so might grant it further power, further reality. It was an ethereal, insatiable hunger, a void that pulsed just beyond human comprehension, leaving only its devastating effects as proof of its existence. This lack of concrete definition made it all the more terrifying, allowing the imagination to fill in the terrifying blanks. The photograph, the very object that had ignited his quest, now carried an entirely new and far more chilling meaning. It transformed from a mere curiosity, a historical oddity, into a chilling testament to human frailty, to the desperate choices made in the face of an incomprehensible horror. and to the fragile line that divides the known world from the terrifying unknown. Each child's face, once seemingly innocent, now seemed to hold a flicker of forgotten fear, a distant memory of a presence that had touched their lives, even if they couldn't articulate it. The light that bathed the scene seemed to cast not shadows, but questions. It was a freeze frame of a moment when the veil between worlds had thinned, and a terrible transaction had taken place, leaving an indelible mark visible only to those who dared to look beyond the superficial. The image was no longer just a picture. It was a portal to a hidden truth, a dark corner of history. As Professor Finch meticulously organized his notes, his mind wrestled with a profound and lingering question. If such unspeakable things had existed then, hidden in the forgotten corners of the world, just beyond the edge of perception, did they still exist now? Were there other shadows missing, other desperate pacts made, other silent screams frozen in time, waiting for someone to notice their absence? He looked out his study window at the bustling modern city, the indifferent rush of daily life, and wondered if humanity's advancements had truly banished such primal fears or merely pushed them further into the unseen, allowing them to fester and perhaps one day to resurface. The cheerful, ordinary world suddenly seemed precariously balanced, its normalcy a thin veneer over ancient, malevolent forces that might still stir. Mary's story, Eleanor's terrible choice, the Shadow Eater's relentless hunger. These were not just historical footnotes. They were an unnerving reminder that some mysteries were perhaps better left undisturbed, and some truths too terrifying to fully comprehend. Yet he knew he had to tell her story. The weight of this newfound knowledge pressed down on Professor Finch, a heavy shroud woven from despair and historical sacrifice. The photograph, once merely an academic curiosity, had transformed into something far more profound, a silent scream frozen in time, a chilling testament to human desperation and a lurking malevolence. He understood now that the cheerful facade of the 1908 school portrait was not an accidental optical illusion, but a deliberate, tragic veneer, carefully constructed to conceal a horrifying truth. Mary, the shadowless child, was no anomaly of light or film, but the living, breathing, yet ultimately lost embodiment of a profound and heart-wrenching tragedy. The cheerful smiles of the other children, the proud posture of the schoolmistress, all now seemed tinged with a desperate attempt at normalcy, a frantic effort to paper over the gaping wound of Mary's sacrifice. Finch saw past the sepia tones, past the stiff poses, and into the abyss of sorrow that lay beneath. His final hours of research were agonizing, not for the intellectual challenge, but for the sheer emotional burden of what he had uncovered. He found no further records of Mary, no grave marker, no mention in any census after 1908. Her existence had been systematically erased, her memory expunged, just as Eleanor Vance had intended. It was as if the town itself had conspired to forget, to bury the terrifying truth alongside the child's missing shadow. The why had become sickeningly clear, revealing the depths of Eleanor's desperation and her tragic miscalculation. But the what, the entity itself, the Shadow Eater of local lore, remained largely undefined, its true nature hinted at in cryptic phrases and terrified scrawls within the photographer's and Eleanor's private journals, but never fully revealed. This deliberate ambiguity preserved an element of cosmic horror, reminding Finch and anyone who dared to look closely that some evils are too vast, too ancient, to be neatly cataloged or fully comprehended. It was a force that preyed on vulnerability, on desperation, manifesting in ways that were both deeply personal and profoundly unsettling. The photograph, once a mere artifact, now screamed its story to Finch. It was a chilling testament to the fragile line between the known and the unknown, the mundane and the monstrous. Every detail, from the slightly blurred edges around Mary to the almost imperceptible flicker of fear in the eyes of the children nearest her, took on a new, horrifying significance. It was a historical document, yes, but also a haunting echo of a terrible bargain, a visual record of a soul bargaining for another, and the devastating cost of that transaction. Finch felt a profound sense of responsibility, a solemn duty to bring Mary's story and Eleanor's desperate act to light. He could not in good conscience let her sacrifice remain buried beneath layers of time and deliberate obfuscation. He spent weeks meticulously organizing his findings, cross-referencing, verifying, and carefully crafting a narrative that honored the historical facts without sensationalizing the supernatural elements, yet without shying away from the profound darkness he had uncovered. Professor Finch's decision was firm. He would publish his findings, not as a ghost story, though it undoubtedly contained elements of one, but as a meticulously researched historical account that laid bare the human tragedy behind the photo, seeking to honor Mary's lost existence and the impossible choice Eleanor had faced. He understood that not all mysteries had happy endings or neat explanations. Some, like this one, exposed the raw, brutal truth of human desperation and the lingering specter of forgotten horrors. His report, when it was finally released, caused a stir in academic circles. It wasn't just the shadowless child that captivated attention, but the intricate web of historical context, folklore, and personal anguish Finch had so carefully unearthed. The story of Mary, the forgotten child, and Eleanor, the desperate school mistress, became a somber footnote in the annals of early 20th century rural life, a stark reminder that history often conceals as much as it reveals. The photograph, now widely reproduced alongside Finch's research, served as a potent symbol, a grim monument to the unseen, the unspoken, and the terrible choices made in moments of profound desperation. It was an indelible mark left on history, a quiet whisper of a world just beyond our perception. Professor Finch often found himself returning to the image, peering into the eyes of the children, searching for any further clues, any hidden sorrow. He would ponder the nature of the shadow eater, wondering if such entities still existed, lurking in the forgotten corners of the world, just beyond the edge of routine human perception. The experience had irrevocably changed him, instilling a deeper skepticism of convenient explanations and a profound empathy for the whispers of history. He learned that the most chilling truths were often hidden in plain sight, disguised as mundane occurrences, waiting for someone with the courage to look beyond the surface. This story serves as a poignant reflection on the importance of questioning what we see, of never accepting the surface value of an image or a historical account. It reminds us to remember those who are often erased from history, whose stories are deemed too inconvenient, too unsettling to be preserved. Mary's story, once lost, now stands as a testament to the fact that even the most seemingly cheerful photograph can hold secrets, can harbor a raw narrative of sacrifice and unseen shadows. My friends, if this deep dive into the unsettling corners of history has moved you, if it has made you question the cheerful facades that hide deeper truths, then please take a moment to like this video. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think happened to Mary? What was the true nature of the shadow eater? And if you crave more journeys into the unexplained, more investigations into historical mysteries that defy easy answers, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Next time, we're going to explore a strange map from the 17th century that depicts land masses that shouldn't exist, challenging everything we thought we knew about early cartography and ancient knowledge. You won't want to miss it.